Good evening, I'm Mehdi Hassan. We are 5 days into the biggest land war between states in Europe since World War II. 5 days since a dictatorship launched a brutal war of aggression against a democracy. Yet there are some slivers of light amid the darkness. For a start, Kyiv is still standing, still uncaptured by the Russians. Ukrainian armed forces have held on to the capital city and managed to push back Russian troops in the country's second largest city of Kharkiv. According to the Pentagon, Russia's faced more resistance than it was expecting. And since Moscow began its invasion last Thursday, many around the world have united in solidarity with the people of Ukraine. Western allies are providing military aid to Ukraine, including even non-aligned Sweden, breaking its historic neutral stance by sending 5,000 anti-tank rockets and body armor and field rations to Kyiv. Even America's opportunist-in-chief, Donald Trump, has stopped fawning over Vladimir Putin and started praising Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, in the context, of course, of his 2019 phone call to Zelensky that led to his first impeachment.
He actually made up a story about my phone call with the president of Ukraine, who, by the way, is a brave man. He's hanging in.
And over in Belarus today, officials from Ukraine and Russia held their first talks. While it didn't lead to any ceasefire or resolution of this conflict, both sides agreed to more talks in the coming days, perhaps signaling hopes for a diplomatic end to this war. The UN has been meeting to try and find a resolution to this crisis, and yesterday America's UN ambassador had this to say.
To the Russian officers and soldiers, I say, the world is watching. Those of us here, safely sitting in this hallowed hall, have a moral responsibility to respond to Russia's desecration of human life.
But that's the question, right? How should the West respond to Putin's desecration of not just human life, but of a country's sovereignty? Is now the time to be escalating or trying to de-escalate? Are there off-ramps that the US and the EU should be offering to Putin right now to try and end this before more people die? As angry and as concerned as many of us rightly are right now, emotions are not a substitute for strategy. Yesterday, Harvard political scientist Stephen Walt, the noted scholar of foreign policy realism, tweeted, quote, "I am reminded of Sun Tzu's dictum that one should build a golden bridge for your enemy to retreat across. Pressure on Russia is necessary, but saving Ukraine also requires making it easier for Moscow to reverse course." Are we making it easier for Moscow to pull back, to end its war? So far, the West's major offensive strategy has been to try and squeeze Russia financially, and it seems to be working. The US and its allies have imposed a host of severe sanctions that are unprecedented for an economy as large and as interconnected with the rest of the world as Russia. Over the weekend, several countries agreed to remove some Russian banks from the international SWIFT system, and sanctions are now targeting the Russian central bank too, which will likely push Russian inflation higher and destabilize its economy. This is a move that, let's be clear, could eviscerate the Russian economy in a way that would amount to collective punishment of millions of Russians. Put aside the morality of it for a moment, even strategically, does it make sense to be cheering on the collapse of a currency, the ruble, and the potential creation of a failed state, Russia, when that state is run by a volatile autocrat who is in possession, whether we like it or not, of thousands of nukes? Should we be risking fomenting more hardline anti-US sentiment by turning Putin's claims of an anti-Russian Western alliance into a sort of reality? Already we've seen people lining up at Russian banks to withdraw their money as the value of the ruble tumbles. But are we sure that they're going to blame Putin for that, or us? Look, I'm all for standing with Ukraine against Russia, but I can't help but wonder, have we thought through the potential consequences of carrying out the financial equivalent of a nuclear strike on Moscow? And those are not my words. They're the words of David Frum, the man who coined George Bush's infamous axis of evil phrase that didn't exactly end well either for world peace or human life. I don't know. Am I being overly sensitive, or should we not be talking even metaphorically about nuclear strikes against a man who already has the world's largest inventory of nuclear warheads? A man who on Sunday said he was putting his nuclear deterrent forces into special combat readiness. Where does this end? How far do we go? Some Western pundits are even starting to talk about bringing regime change to Russia, which is also crazy. Have we learned nothing of the devastation that comes to a country and its people in particular when we try to oust a leader? let alone a nuclear-armed country? Remember, this is a nation where a TV host just claimed that Russians are, quote, capable of launching 500 nuclear warheads, which guarantees the destruction of the US and all NATO countries to boot. Sheesh. We're also seeing reports that US banks are preparing for a Russian cyber attack in retaliation for Western sanctions, and a NATO official warned today that depending on how serious it is, it could trigger NATO's Article 5, the Collective Defense Clause. What does that lead to? Because despite everyone across the political spectrum agreeing as recently as last week that the US would not be taking military action against Russia on behalf of Ukraine, there are now growing calls for a no-fly zone. Dangerous calls, in my view, including from President Zelensky himself, understandably, which Axios reported earlier today, and from Republican Congressman and veteran Adam Kinzinger, among others. For those of you who may not be aware of this, if the US sets up a no-fly zone over Ukraine, that will be a declaration of war against Russia. It will. Thankfully, the White House press secretary explained that earlier today.
Well, here's what's important for everybody to know about a no-fly zone. What that would require is implementation by the U.S. military. It would essentially mean the U.S. military would be shooting down planes, Russian planes. That is definitely escalatory. That would potentially put us into a place where we're in a military conflict with Russia. That is not something the president wants to do.
Look, it's clear the Russian military on the ground in Ukraine is thankfully struggling for now, and we should all be inspired by Ukraine's resistance. But at the same time, let's not romanticize a faraway war. No one should be under the false pretense that Ukrainians can hold off Russian forces indefinitely, or that Putin can't start carpet bombing the country tomorrow if he wants to. Remember Chechnya. Or that the US and its allies are dealing with some tiny, weak country that they can just overrun. This is no joke. War is hell. Millions of people's lives could be at stake, not just in Ukraine or even in Russia, but beyond that region. So what are we willing to do to try and end this war before it escalates further? Or is it too early to start talking about compromise? Would that be letting down the brave Ukrainian people? Joining me now to discuss all of this is Stephen Walt, Professor of International Relations at Harvard University, and a columnist at Foreign Policy magazine, Julia Ioffe, co-founder and DC correspondent for Puck News, and the former French ambassador to the United States, Gerard Araud. Thank you all for joining me this evening. Stephen, let me start with you. You tweeted out that Sun Tzu quote yesterday about building a golden bridge for your enemies. What does a golden bridge in Ukraine right now look like? And is it too soon to be talking about this, given we've only just started pressuring Putin?
I don't think it's too early to start talking about it, in part because there's been these premature declarations of victory by some commentators in the West. It's clear that the Russian invasion has not gone as smoothly as Moscow had hoped. That's good news as well. And this has immediately been interpreted as sort of an opportunity to try and humiliate Russia as much as possible. And as you mentioned in your opening, even some calls from people who should know better that what we should be pushing for is some kind of regime change, that the only solution here is the eventual removal of Vladimir Putin. This is the kind of thing that, gets really major wars started. If you're trying to get Russia to turn around, you don't want to suggest that that's what your objective is here. Our goal is to get Russia out of Ukraine in a way that satisfies Ukrainians' desire to live independent, sovereign lives and minimizes the risk of war going forward. And if that requires us not to humiliate Russia and to give them some face-saving ways out, then that's obviously in our interest. It's very much in Ukraine's interest because, of course, the longer this war goes on, the more damage will be done to Ukraine more than anyone else.
Julia, what is your response to Stephen's argument about offering a face-saving way out? We all want this war to end, and soon. What's the best way to do that, in your view?
Well, I'm not sure, and I'm so glad that I'm not paid to, find solutions. But I do agree with Professor Walt that, finding some kind of off-ramp, even at this stage, would be ideal. The question is, how is that possible? Because I think it's gotten harder. The Golden Bridge has been there this entire time. The U.S. and Europe, who have been trying to engage in diplomacy with Russia for the last 2 months at least, have been trying to build this Golden Bridge for Russia, and Russia refused to retreat across it. And I think in part because what Putin wants, and I hate to use that phrase, but what Putin wants is something that we cannot give him. He wants Ukraine. And what was so interesting to me in this last week was that over the weekend, Russian RIA News, which is a state news organization, published this long op-ed saying, hurrah, Ukraine has been conquered. Now Russia is there's the Russian world. It's been reconstituted of Great Russia, White Russia, which is what Belarus means, and Little Russia, which is Ukraine. And now we can counterbalance the Anglo-Saxon world. And of course, it seemed to be kind of jumping the gun and seemed like a piece that the Kremlin had planned to publish if its campaign had gone as planned, which we know it hasn't. So it seems that, we got an insight into what they want. And I don't know if that's their goal here, what do we offer them? And
that's a fair point.
The other thing I would say is that, sorry, can I just add this point? The other thing is that he has made EU membership and NATO membership, not just in Ukraine more popular, but in Finland more popular. Finland, which has been neutral for this very reason for this long, popular desire for NATO membership has shot through the roof. There was a poll that just came out today where over half of Finns now want to join Finland.
Yes, and Julia, I spoke to the former Finnish Prime Minister yesterday on this show on MSNBC, and he was saying similar things, which I am going to return back to. But I'm going to bring in Ambassador Haro. French President Emmanuel Macron has been in touch with Putin in recent days. Macron had a call with him earlier today, and his office said that Putin confirmed his willingness to commit on 3 points: stopping all strikes on civilians in Ukraine, preserving civilian infrastructure, and providing safe access to key roads. What should we make of this, Ambassador? Does France, does Europe more broadly really see a diplomatic end to this conflict anytime soon? It doesn't look like that from the US, I know.
No, every crisis is moving by stages. And right now we are in a stage where on one side, the Russians can hope to get everything they want. It will be maybe more difficult, more painful than it was forecast, but nevertheless, right now, after 6 days of conflict, they can say, we'll take Kiev. We may win. On the other side, the Ukrainians, excited, I should say, by the occasion, by their pride, national pride, really want to fight. So unfortunately, I think that, like it happens in any crisis, for the moment, we can't do a lot. But actually, we should be prepared. When it's possible, we should be prepared to try, really to move both sides to the table of negotiation. And I think it's what Macron is trying to do. And he's doing it with the agreement of Zelensky. Is really to keep open a line of communication with Putin.
Stephen, you recently told the New York Times that you, quote, find it difficult to believe that any world leader, including Mr. Putin, would seriously contemplate using nuclear weapons for the simple reason that they understand the consequences. But you look at Putin, and it's also hard to see him as someone who's acting rationally right now. He's the one who's declaring a nuclear alert, not to mention this brazen illegal invasion in the first place. What are we supposed to believe when it comes to Putin's behavior, whether he's acting in his country's best interests, whether he's in a stable place right now? I mean, he's sitting at epically long tables miles away from his own financial and military advisors.
Well, first of all, there are lots of leaders of lots of countries who've made grotesque miscalculations that have damaged their countries in various ways. So that doesn't mean that they would then contemplate the use of nuclear weapons. And the only saving grace here is the fact that it doesn't take a genius, it doesn't take even a very stable person to realize what the use of nuclear weapons would begin to mean. And for that reason, I don't think there's a serious risk here. There is some danger, of course, and that's one of the reasons why the West, however great the desire to punish Russia might be at this point, has to be careful. After all, if Putin is as irrational as some people say he is, then the last thing you would want to do is absolutely corner them to start to talk about matters of regime change. The other thing to bear in mind is this is very early in this process, right? And as Ambassador Arauz said, it's quite possible that Russia will be able to gain most of its military objectives in time. They have assets they have not used yet. The initial invasion has not gone particularly well, but no one should assume that they can't ultimately be militarily successful at great cost to Ukraine. And that means we have to start thinking about what's the kind of arrangement that would be acceptable to us, even if it's not what we would want. And I think the likely outcome here is that no one will ultimately get what they really wanted. Russia is clearly not getting a divided NATO. Russia is not getting a cheap, quick victory. Russia is not going to be able to dominate Ukraine, even if at some point they put a puppet regime in there. There are lots of ways in which Russia is going to fall short of what might have been their initial hopes and objectives. Point is that Ukraine may not get what it wants either. It may not get NATO membership because the solution to this will be ultimately some kind of armed neutrality for Ukraine. And the United States may not get everything it might want in all of this as well. Usually when you get a protracted conflict, the only way to solve it is by everyone agreeing to get a little bit less than they might have initially wanted or initially hoped.
A very fair point. Julie, I want to pick up on a point Stephen just made a moment ago about, you can't say he's a rational guy and an irrational guy at the same time. He's both a hawk who wants to fight, but he's someone we can intimidate at the same time. I used to hear the same debate around Iran. They're crazy, they're going to bomb us, but we can sanction them into the ground and they won't respond. And I worry when I hear Adam Kinzinger saying we can bring in a no-fly zone, but, he's not going to respond because we killed Russians in Syria. Like, either he is going to lash out and, God forbid, use nukes, or he's not as threatening as we're told he is. Which one is it? Do you see the kind of confusion that I'm identifying?
Yeah, and I think it's because often what we mean when we say somebody is not rational, we mean they don't think like us. And Putin certainly doesn't think like Americans do, but he is rational within his own parameters. It's just like we're in base 10 and he's in base 12. He is rational within, again, his logical framework. And that's what worries me, is that in his framework, he doesn't have a lot to lose. And he didn't take many of the off-ramps that were offered to him within the last 2 months. There wasn't even, there were many diplomatic meetings, but not really serious negotiations went on. If anything, he used them then as a pretext to say, look, we tried, and now we're invading Ukraine. And now I worry that precisely because his invasion isn't going well, that he will escalate because the West punished him, but didn't really have an option to not punish him for doing this, that he will continue to escalate. I worry that he will turn Kiev into Grozny. I worry that, we saw Kharkiv, we saw cluster munitions being used on civilian areas. He's clearly stepping things up and playing far more dirty and beginning to bomb civilian areas in a way that they were clearly avoiding earlier. Yeah. And that's what I'm worried about, because in that very rational framework, he cannot lose this. He cannot be humiliated by what he sees as little Russia, as a little country in his view, with a fake independence, which should be part of Russia. And I worry that we don't know if he will use a nuclear weapon or not. Like, we hope he won't. No. It's likely, but it doesn't mean he won't.
That's a good point.
Because he does not want to be humiliated here. He will not lose this.
Good point. It's a scary time. Last question to you, Ambassador, on something more broader, which is this EU has been acting very graciously, responsibly with this influx of Ukrainian refugees, rightfully so. France, your country, which heads the EU Council presidency, is proposing that the bloc adopts a temporary protection directive, which would grant those fleeing the conflict immediate and temporary protection. There's talk of the EU asking for 3 years residency for Ukrainian refugees. But this is coming from a country, France, whose leader, President Macron, back in August last year, said France had to protect itself from a wave of migrants from Afghanistan. Poland and Hungary opened borders to Ukrainians, but closed them to Afghans and Syrians. Many would say, what is that if not straight up racism?
No, I think, it's a very good point. there are a lot of discussions on the French media. It's on that, and I think on European media, because France is not, as you pointed out, France, Poland, Hungary, but also other European countries are reacting the same. I think, and it's not a way of condoning it or approving it. The fact is that the Europeans feel closer to Ukrainians who are Europeans to people from other continent. You can say it's a shame, but that's a fact. It's really the way public opinions are reacting today.
It's a fair point. I take what you're saying, but it's also a fact then that when European countries said there's no space for people to come in here, there's no resources, that wasn't true. There is space and resources when it's people who look like you, as you're conceding.
Oh, of course. Really, I wouldn't defend, the idea of saying we take Ukrainians and we don't take Afghans. Really, also, like in your own country, like in the US, how much immigration has become a sort of a toxic topic, and which is used by the far right, how powerful the far right is everywhere. And the fact is, by the way, that the French are going to elect a new president in 6 weeks. So obviously, it's a factor.
It is indeed. Interesting times. Stephen Walt, Julia Ioffe, and Ambassador Gerard Auroux, thank you all for a fascinating conversation. Appreciate it. The crisis in Ukraine is expected to be front and center in President Biden's first State of the Union address tomorrow night, but there's plenty for him to discuss on the domestic front as well, including his new nominee for the Supreme Court. Tomorrow is also the first contest of the 2022 midterms, with Texas holding its primary elections for the House, as well as governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general, among other key races. We'll have special coverage late into the night, analyzing the president's speech and updating you on the results as they come in from Texas. My guests will include Pennsylvania Democratic Congresswoman Susan Wild and former California Democratic Senator Barbara Boxer. Special coverage on The Choice from MSNBC starts at 6 p.m. Eastern with my colleague Selena Maxwell, and I'll see you right here starting at 7 p.m. Eastern going into the night. But when we come back tonight, we'll get to know Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky a little better in order to understand how his past career has maybe prepared him for this historic moment. Don't go away. Do you remember the first time you heard the name Vladimir Zelensky? I'm guessing it was way back in 2019, the before times, at the very start of the 2020 presidential primaries, when a certain perfect phone call between Trump and Zelensky came to light. That's how then President Trump described it anyways. Only days before the two men talked, Trump had frozen $400 million in U.S. military aid to Ukraine. And then, conveniently, when they did speak, Trump said, quote, "I would like you to do us a favor, though." And that favor was repeatedly pressing Zelensky to investigate Joe Biden and his family. And thus, ladies and gents, the basis of the first impeachment of Donald J. Trump was born. That was America's introduction to Vladimir Zelensky. He was soon forgotten, though, as the first impeachment was overtaken by George Floyd protests, the presidential election, the insurrection, and the second impeachment. But tonight, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky is arguably the most popular leader in the world, the most talked about, perhaps the most famous one. His response to Russia's invasion has been called Churchillian, and his bravery has been praised by everyone from former President Trump to Succession's Brian Cox, a.k.a. Logan Roy. Zelensky has refused to evacuate Kyiv in the midst of the crisis, sharing defiant videos from the capital city out and about to motivate his people. So, who is this man who has suddenly skyrocketed to world hero status? What kind of career path shaped this death-defyingly brave leader? You might have heard he was an actor and an entertainer, but you may not be aware of all the amazing details. I mean, President Zelensky won the Ukrainian version of Dancing with the Stars in 2006, and he looked good doing it. In fact, it seems he's rarely missed a chance to show off his dancing skills to Ukrainian audiences, no matter how bawdy. And speaking of bawdy, here he is again with a member of his sketch comedy group pretending to play the piano without laying a finger on the keys. Zelensky is also a successful actor. He was the voice of Paddington Bear in 2 feature films in Ukraine, and in a version of life imitating art from 2015 to 2019 on a show called Servant of the People, Zelensky played a school teacher who finds himself unexpectedly winning the presidential race after a video of him ranting against political corruption goes viral.
Из 2 пи***расов выбираем меньше. И так 25 лет подряд. Ты знаешь, что интересно? В этот раз ничего не поменяется. Знаешь почему? Потому что ты, мой батя, я, мы снова выберем пи***аса. Да потому что, да, понятно. Конечно, он пи***ас, да ну лучше его, те-то хуже.
Вась, да пойдем хряпнем, у меня заначка есть.
Главное, приходят эти потом пи***асы власть. Пи***ят и пи***ят, и пи***ят ударение.
In many cases, a politician with an entertainment background could appear to lack substance. Think Donald J. Trump, for example. And Zelensky's lighthearted career might not immediately seem to fit the brief of courageous man. But in this case, the president's theatrical background might have actually made him the perfect man for this moment. His presence and ease in front of a camera have given him a magnetism that's able to command a global audience and rally support. He's been able to create videos that are inspiring. He's been able to spread his message effectively. When he refused an offer from the US to leave Ukraine, Ashraf Ghani style, Zelensky had a response that sounded like it could have come from the mouth of Die Hard's John McClane. Quote, "I need ammunition, not a ride." This isn't just empty rhetoric either. When faced with resistance from European leaders to impose the harshest of sanctions on Russia, Zelensky launched into an emotional plea for support, punctuated by a warning that he may never be seen alive again. According to the Washington Post, just that quickly, Zelensky's personal appeal overwhelmed the resistance from European leaders to imposing measures that could drive the Russian economy into a state of near collapse. Zelensky's courage may appear unlikely, but those figures often turn out to be the most compelling heroes. The Ukrainian president has also been able to rally members of the opposition behind his government as the country fights off Russian aggression. One of those opposition lawmakers, Inna Sovsun, a member of the Ukrainian parliament, joins me now live from Kyiv. Thank you so much for joining me. What do you make of President Zelensky's leadership over the past few weeks? Were you surprised to see the way he's met this challenge?
Well, I actually am, because I'm a representative of the opposition political party. And we were actually very critical of President Zelensky before. But I think right now he's standing up to the challenge. And trust me, I would, if someone told me I would be saying that a week ago, I would just laugh about that. But now I'm saying that Zelensky is doing a good job, and also I own a gun. So the realities here in Ukrainian politics have really changed.
And leaders from all over the world have been praising Zelensky. How much do you think the president's presence and voice has helped rally support for your country from around the world?
I think both the very atrocities of the Russian war and the cruelty of it, and the very lack of sense in any of this happening has been driving support to the Ukrainian cause overall. But the very fact that President Zelensky, as well as all the leadership of the country, like the majority of the MPs, are staying in Kyiv, including myself, President Zelensky is staying in Kyiv, and he's just showing this example. But then also just ordinary Ukrainians fighting as hard as they can against Russians here in Ukraine, which led to slowing down of Russian invasion, and basically just Russians having to change their plans of blitzkrieg over Kyiv. That did a great job overall, and I think that is why we feel so much support from all over the world right now.
In a recent interview with the BBC, you said that you had been given a gun to defend yourself, and that your father, who can barely walk, you said, came back to Kyiv after leaving other members of your family and vowed to defend the city, even if he had to crawl to do so. That was 2 days ago. Can I ask, how is your father now?
Well, he is with the territorial defense, like 100,000 other volunteers. So people are just signing up to patrol the streets to help the Ukrainian army and the police, the National Guard. those are the volunteers. Some of them did have a military experience, like my dad. He was fighting in Afghanistan before. Some of them didn't, but they are helping there, particularly with those infiltrators group that Russia sent to the Ukrainian cities and towns to provoke some situations like random shootings on the streets, or helping to set the targets for the missiles attack. So those infiltrators group are the biggest danger for Kyiv right now. So they're being cleared out of the city, and the territorial defense is doing a great job in helping them in that. But the military, the army, is doing the best job of all. I think no one expected a small Ukraine to fight as hard as we did, and I'm extremely proud of the Ukrainian military.
No, I don't think people did expect Ukraine to put up this kind of defense, amazingly. I don't think the Russians certainly expected your country to do that. But of course, as Stephen Walt, a guest on the show earlier in this hour, was pointing out, the Russians still haven't thrown the full weight of their military at the Ukrainians. It could get much worse, God forbid. Many more people could die. And you have these talks going on between your government and Russia's government in Belarus. You have the French president trying to get Vladimir Putin to sign up to some basic principles of de-escalation. What would you, as a Ukrainian citizen, a Ukrainian lawmaker, be willing to compromise on to get the Russians out of your country? Whether it's recognizing the Russian claim to Crimea, which was illegally annexed by Moscow in 2014, whether it's Ukraine agreeing never to join NATO. What would you at this point be willing to say that should be on the table because we need to end this war?
So imagine someone started bombing American cities and then entering troops on the ground and annexing part of your territory, one of the states, and then saying, like, let's set the compromise. I think that in the situation where the Russians want us dead and we want to leave, there is, frankly speaking, very little room for compromise. Because the only thing we can agree upon is the conditions of their surrender. Because right now they are losing the war here in Ukraine, and they should surrender. They will have to surrender. The major question is just how long that will take. So I think that those were the only things that were on the table, frankly speaking. All the other things we were hearing from Putin, like let's make sure. Say it again. All the other things where we were hearing from Putin, like Ukraine would claim that we would never join NATO. Let me remind to everyone that Putin attacked Ukraine in 2014 when Ukraine was officially a neutral state, non-allied state with no NATO perspectives. So everything Putin is saying is basically lie. He's lying every time he's opening his mouth. So we are just not trusting anything he's saying. We just want him out of our country.
That is fair enough. Ina Sovsun, please do stay safe, and thank you for taking time out tonight to join us live. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
As the fighting rages on, more than 500,000 Ukrainians have fled the country. The majority of them, about 300,000, have gone to Poland, some waiting for hours at border crossings to reach safety. This was earlier today, where refugees dealt with snow and freezing temperatures, many with no idea what may come next. But there are volunteers on the ground making sure that the thousands crossing the border can at least get a hot meal. That includes Chef Jose Andres and his non-profit, the World Central Kitchen, who are in Poland along the border with Ukraine. So far, they've served more than 8,000 meals. I spoke to Chef Jose from near the border earlier this evening. Jose Andres, thank you for coming back on the show, especially from where you are. What is the situation on the ground there tonight? How bad is it? How cold is it?
Well, it's really super cold, freezing temperatures. I've been able in the last 24 hours to visit different little towns where are the places where all the Ukrainians are trying to leave the mayhem in their countries and come into the safety of Poland. In little towns like in Reben, in Budomierz, in Lubica, in Medica, in all these places is the same thing. As people cross, they are welcome there. Obviously, they give them a stamp on the passport. They divide sometimes the Ukrainians from other nationalities coming from Ukraine. They make sure that then they send them to kind of a welcoming center. They give them a place where they can get hot food, hot tea, anything else they need. They find their loved ones that sometimes, or friends that they are waiting for them. They take them to a temporary welcoming home. And from there, once they are put in a list, they will be sent with buses to shelters that they are in different parts of Poland. But I can tell you one thing. We know that many people is taking a long time to leave Ukraine because it's hundreds of thousands of people living with a lot of cars that they are just broken down without batteries or without gas, and is what is making a very difficult trek to leave Ukraine. That's why you see a lot of women with children and everything they have in their possession used in a suitcase, walking for hours, for days, to try to reach the safety into Poland.
And Jose, I believe you and your non-profit World Central Kitchen have provided more than 8,000 meals so far, or more than that probably since I last checked. What are people telling you about their experiences? You mentioned a lot of these women and children coming without the men who have to stay behind and fight. What do they tell you about their experiences, about what they're fleeing from?
Well, obviously the people living because they are scared, because they feel their towns, they've been about to be under siege or under fire. They say that they don't understand why their Russian brothers are attacking them. The stories of children telling you, as you give them sometimes something to eat, my dad stay behind with tears in their eyes. At the same time, when I was in Medica yesterday, and as I was seeing many people getting into Poland, I could see sometimes groups of 5 or 10 very young men. One time, an American that I was too tired to don't even ask him for his name, that they were going in the opposite direction. They were getting into Ukraine with one very simple objective: to join their people, to fight for the freedom of their country, to fight next to all the people defending Ukraine. And this, quite frankly, when you go back to the comfort of the place you are staying in the hotel, this breaks your heart, because you know it's people that they are doing everything they can to defend their homeland. At the same time that these many Ukrainians that are in Poland next to the Polish people, who, by the way, I want to repeat, the Polish people are doing an amazing job on behalf of all humanity. They're taking care of every Ukrainian or any person living in Ukraine like if they are brothers. And this is the only thing that gives you hope for humanity.
And Jose, quick last question. What made you want to go out to the border with Ukraine? You are a celebrity chef, and yet you and your non-profit World Central Kitchen have turned up at some of the world's worst humanitarian crises, from Haiti to Houston to Puerto Rico, to help deliver free food. What motivates you?
Listen, I have my team of World Central Kitchen moved here within hours of we were following what was happening with the Russian troops in the border, and we already were nearby. Waiting. I had to come to join my team, and in these early hours, in these early days, is when we can orchestrate a response. That this is a marathon, this is not 100 meters, so we're trying to come up with the different plans and work in coordination with big NGOs like World Food Program, who obviously are here, International Red Cross, others. But I want to say it's a lot of Polish organizations, volunteers, that, my God, they're responding in a way that I didn't see in many places anywhere around the world. So this is very, very amazing to see. So I'm very pleased to see the reaction, I repeat myself, of the Polish people taking care of all the Ukrainians coming in.
We are pleased to see you out there. Stay safe, my friend. God bless you for what you do. And thank you for joining us on the show tonight.
Let's pray for the people of Ukraine, people. Let's do this. The least we can do.
Jose Andres, what a guy. Coming up.
We got to hold Democrats accountable, everybody, right? Fire Fauci. We've got to investigate Hillary Clinton's campaign. Lock her up. Lock them all up.
If you thought those words from Marjorie Taylor Greene at CPAC on Saturday were chilling, wait until you hear where she spoke the night before. We'll tell you more after this break. Don't go away. In just a few months, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy may become the House Speaker, and he wants you to know he takes anti-Semitism very seriously.
I was asking Nancy Pelosi to stand up to these new Democrat socialists who are making these anti-Semitic comments. If it is allowed to happen in the halls of Congress, it will only perpetuate the problem. I will pledge to you this. From this side of the aisle, and I hope you understand this clearly. Any hatred, we take action.
Well, Congressman McCarthy, prepare to take action, because you will be shocked to learn that 2 members of your conference took time out of their busy weekends to support this guy.
This is going to be the most racist. Whoa!
That piece of work is Nick Fuentes, and according to the Anti-Defamation League, he's a white supremacist who hit it big after participating in the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. He popped up again at the US Capitol on January the 6th, 2021. His group received a mysterious payment of $250,000 in Bitcoin from overseas just before the riot, so it's not terribly surprising that he got a subpoena last month from the January 6th committee. Fuentes, quite the overachiever, also organizes an annual America First Political Action Conference. And this year, he really turned the fascism and racism up to 11.
They go and they write their articles and they say, he's a white nationalist. He's a racist. Why won't Republicans condemn him? And I read these articles and I think, who are they writing these for? Nobody cares. We don't care. And now they're going on about Russia and Vladimir Putin is Hitler. And they say that's not a good thing. You think you can replace us? You're wrong. We will replace you.
Who buys and sells this hateful far-right garbage? Well, how about Arizona State Senator Wendy Rogers, who spoke to the conference and told Republicans to take power and lynch their political enemies? But you'd think no sitting Republican member of Congress wants to touch that sort of authoritarian stupidity, right? Right?
Hello, everyone. This is Congressman Paul Gosar. I wish all of you a great conference.
That's a warm video welcome to the White Nationalist Conference by pro-insurrection Representative Paul Gosar of Arizona. He had actually been the keynote speaker a year earlier. You may remember Gosar as the guy who shared an animated video depicting violence against AOC and President Biden. That post got him stripped of his committee assignments and censured. But Gosar wasn't the only member of Congress involved in this weekend's anti-democratic get-together. There was a surprise speaker, though actually, when you think about it, not that surprising.
Everything that this Congress does that I am tragically heartbroken to be a part of is evil. Masking children is child abuse. The Democrat Party doesn't care about our country. But here's where they're going. They're forcing us to be slaves to China for energy. That's what the Democrats believe in, because that's what Marxism is. That's what communism is.
Yep, that is Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who said forest fires might be caused by a Jewish-run space laser, who blames most everything on Jewish financier George Soros, who likened her plight as a mask wearer to that of Holocaust Jews forced by Nazis to wear yellow stars. Comments that got her stripped of her committee assignments last year, again by Democrats with the support of only 11 Republicans, and none of them were named Kevin McCarthy. Look, Nick Fuentes is the worst of the worst, but he is no longer a fringe figure on the right. He was welcomed to former President Trump's right-wing social network and given the VIP prize, a verified account, marking him as a real influencer in the Donald's world. He's gone from having one Republican member at his conference, Paul Gosar, to two, Gosar and Greene, this year. Today, just moments earlier this evening, Leader McCarthy finally called out Gosar and Green for their attendance at that conference. He condemned them. The question is, what are you actually going to do about it, Kevin? Coming up, President Biden has named his pick for the Supreme Court. So what's next for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson? We're back after a short break. Don't go away. Ever since a vacancy came up on the Supreme Court, Republicans have insisted that President Biden pick someone who can get votes from both parties. I don't recall President Trump using that criteria, but I digress. Interestingly, though, bipartisan support is not unheard of for President Biden's court picks. Last summer, he nominated a highly qualified district court judge to the D.C. Court of Appeals, a Harvard Law grad and a former clerk for Justice Stephen Breyer. And 3 Senate Republicans joined Democrats in supporting her: Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, and Lindsey Graham. So imagine my surprise last week when that same judge, Ketanji Brown Jackson, was nominated by President Biden for the Supreme Court. And Lindsey Graham said this, quote, "If media reports are accurate and Judge Jackson has been chosen as the Supreme Court nominee to replace Justice Breyer, it means the radical left has won President Biden over yet again." Oh, hypocrisy. Lindsey be thy name. I mean, was Graham part of this radical left when he voted to confirm Jackson less than 9 months ago? But listen, this confirmation process could actually end up being one of the smoothest ones we've seen in recent years. A low bar, I know. The White House says Minority Leader Mitch McConnell is meeting with Jackson this week. You may remember that Mitch wouldn't even meet with Merrick Garland when he was President Obama's nominee in 2016. 46% of voters, meanwhile, say they want Jackson confirmed, according to a new Politico Morning Consult survey. That's more initial support than any of Trump's nominees got. The closest was Neil Gorsuch, who had 43% support after his nomination was announced. Is that maybe because the Republicans know that regardless of who Joe Biden puts on the Supreme Court, they still have a 6-3 majority? Joining me now to discuss all this is Melissa Murray. She's a professor of law at NYU and a former clerk for Sonia Sotomayor. She's now an NBC News and MSNBC contributor and was among those legal eagles that President Biden considered for this Supreme Court nomination. Melissa, thanks for coming back on the show. You would have been a great candidate for the Supreme Court, and maybe your time will come again soon. Fingers crossed. But for now, we have Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, who I think we both can agree is a very qualified candidate. What are your thoughts on her nomination, a former public defender for the first time nominated?
I think this was an absolutely brilliant nomination. There were so many great women to choose from, and really the president had an embarrassment of riches. But Ketanji Brown Jackson is an absolutely phenomenal nominee, one who brings wide and varied experience in all facets of the legal profession. She has been in a law firm. She's been a public defender. She's been a member of the Sentencing Commission. She has clerked for the federal judiciary at 3 different levels. That would be a first on the Supreme Court. And she would be the only other justice besides Justice Sotomayor to have also served as a trial court as well as an appellate judge. So again, this is an absolutely brilliant nominee. I'm not sure what all the Republican bellyaching is about.
So on the Republican side, a few things to discuss. Number one, how worried are you that parts of the GOP will go full racist during her confirmation hearings?
Well, I think the GOP is going to do what the GOP is going to do, but I think Democrats are in a great position because this is a nominee with so many fantastic credentials, so highly qualified. But I think it's going to be hard to take her down without looking churlish, without looking small-minded, without looking like you're really just bringing it to someone who clearly is qualified and ready to serve. So I think if the Republicans decide to go full throttle on this one, it'll be a poor move, a political miscalculation, because I think the American public is excited about this historic nomination and about this highly qualified nominee.
Melissa, if you think Republicans are concerned about looking trollish or small-minded, I'll introduce you to Senators Ron Johnson, John Kennedy, and Ted Cruz. But I would say this. There is a scenario in which the Republicans actually let this go through in a relatively unscathed way and don't go in full attack mode. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't really affect them, does it? Because they still get to keep their 6-3 majority. And it's amazing for American history and politics to have a black woman on the court. It's inspiring. It's necessary. But at the end of the day, it doesn't change the way decisions are going to come down unless the Democrats agree to expand the court, which isn't on the agenda. Joe Biden hasn't got behind that. And this 6-3 majority is locked in for the foreseeable future, is it not?
So I think you are exactly right that this is a firm 6-3 conservative supermajority, and that does not look like it's likely to change absent something unforeseen. But I don't think it's the case that this nomination is not meaningful beyond its symbolic importance. Ketanji Brown Jackson is going to join a liberal minority that will be entirely composed of women and will be 2/3 women of color. These will be the people who are dissenting, who are writing the dissents that hopefully in time will become majority opinions. And in this moment, even as they are part of that hobbled liberal minority, they will better reflect a true multiracial democracy than that conservative 6-3 super majority. And so I think that by itself is actually symbolic. The optics of it are quite powerful. And maybe that's part of why the Republicans are already casting about trying to find ways to bring down this nominee.
Melissa, where do you stand on expanding the court? For me, regular viewers of this show know it's one of the biggest issues for me. I don't believe you can fix American politics or protect American democracy with a permanent, and I would argue stolen 6-3 Republican majority.
I think it's a really difficult question. And I think the question that people always raise is if the Democrats expand the court in this go around, will it just be met with tit for tat going forward with the Republicans also parrying back with an expanded court? I think there are lots of different kinds of structural interventions that can be made to recalibrate the nature of the court. People have talked about term limits. And actually, I think the prospect of term limits might not even require a constitutional amendment, because you could simply have Supreme Court justices serve their terms and then retire to other federal courts to do the rest of their work and enjoy lifetime tenure there. That might be a very plausible way to go about this and to ensure that presidents have an even number of Supreme Court positions to fill as they go through their terms. But again, I think there are a lot of people in the country right now who recognize that the Supreme Court is a minoritarian institution by design. And right now it is in a position to thwart what are majoritarian preferences in a lot of the different aspects of public policy. And I think that's something that we have to be concerned about.
I guess on the tit for tat issue, I would probably say the Republicans already changed the size of the court when they held it at 8 for a year prior to President Trump taking over and taking that seat from Obama. One last quick question before we run out of time. She's a former public defender on a court that's been dominated by prosecutors for a long time. How big a deal is that?
Well, I think it's symbolic, not just that she's a public defender on this court, and she would be the first public defender, and indeed the first justice who has had criminal defense experience since 1991 when Thurgood Marshall left the bench. But I think it also speaks broadly to President Biden's plan to diversify the federal judiciary more broadly. He has nominated more public defenders to federal judgeships than any other president, and I think that's a really formidable change. As you say, prosecutors have predominated. So this is a really important sea change, not just for the Supreme Court, but at all levels of the federal judiciary.
Well said. Melissa Murray, we'll have to leave it there. And I'm going to say again, it is pretty awesome that you were on the shortlist being considered. Thank you for your time tonight.
Thanks so much, Mehdi. Before
we go tonight, remember just last week I mentioned Senator Ted Cruz's photo op in Mar-a-Lago sitting underneath that bizarre artwork of a slimline Donald Trump. Remember that? Well, it turns out that Cruz isn't the only Republican member of Congress willing to make a fool of himself in that way. Take a look at this image captured by the New York Times of Republican Congressman Dan Crenshaw sitting in his conference room. At a first glance, you would think that's just a normal battlefield picture there in the background, right? Well, let's zoom in. These aren't photoshopped images, I promise you. This is actually the painting in Congressman Crenshaw's conference room. There's Donald Trump, of all people, in charge, riding on a horse on the battlefield. His bone spurs seem to be just fine on that battlefield. You'll also see Jared Kushner doing not much of anything, plus presidential sons number 1 and number 2, Junior and Eric. What are they up to? And look, it's Dan Crenshaw himself there in that painting, the only one in the painting who actually served in combat. As many of you know, Dan Crenshaw and I have clashed on this very show, and we will most likely continue to agree on virtually nothing. But that does not change the fact that Congressman Crenshaw did risk his life for this country as a Navy SEAL. Why he would debase himself next to these grifters who have not fought in uniform a single day in their lives remains a mystery to me. But if you had any doubt that the GOP is now a full-on personality cult, well, I guess the artwork that Republicans choose to be photographed next to tells you everything you need to know. That does it for me tonight. Make sure to join us tomorrow for our special coverage of President Biden's first ever State of the Union and the Texas primary results. Special coverage on The Choice from MSNBC kicks off 6 p.m. Eastern with my colleague Zelina. And I'll see you right back here starting at 7 p.m. Eastern tomorrow and going late into the night. Good night. Hi, I'm Mehdi Hasan. Thanks for checking out our channel on YouTube. You can see more of the Mehdi Hasan Show by clicking on any of the videos on this screen, and make sure you subscribe below to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. Thank you for watching.